So anyway, I just watched a video called Evolution versus Creationism. Listen to the scientists. And of course, as you can imagine, what they mean is listen to the scientists on their side of the debate. Started out with a bunch of elevator music. It was very clearly a propaganda piece, and I cannot imagine the average high school student watching this and taking this seriously, because I think they'd look at it and say, you know what, this is just the same type of garbage that they give me in a classroom, where they have these kind of cheap, poorly made videos. And not that this isn't a cheap video, because this is me on my webcam, but you know the kind of video I'm talking about. You sit there in the classroom and you listen to this stupid video about washing your hands, which is important to wash your hands, but you listen to these cheap, horrible propaganda videos that kind of talk down to people and are kind of beneath a high school student, let's be honest. And I think this video was kind of beneath any intelligent person. Actually, this is way beneath any intelligent person. They started out in the video, this one person who is a philosopher, ironically, in a video about evolution versus creationism, listen to the scientists. And I couldn't find anything about her being like a scientific philosopher, because there is such a thing as philosophers of science. There are people who get a science degree and they also get a philosophy degree. And they study things like the history and philosophy of science and study how scientific thought itself proceeds. You know, how did people in the 1800s perceive science versus how do people in the 1920s perceive science versus how people today perceive science, things like this. But the video started out with this philosopher who doesn't seem to be, her name's Barbara Forrest, and I couldn't find anything about her having any science background at all, let alone being a scientist. Anyway, she says that a segment of the American population, so she's like, there's this segment of the American population, there's these guys. And she says, for religious reasons. She says, for religious reasons, they can't accept most of the modern world, and they reject evolution. And I'm sitting here like, what most of the modern world is she talking about? You know, conservative Christians tend to have a computer. They live in a house, and we're not out in the woods living under some sticks. I mean, what is she talking about? We can't accommodate most of the modern world. I mean, I don't know what she's talking about. Basically, she's just making something up on the spot, saying, well, they can't accommodate most of the or what did she say? She said that we can't accommodate. The actual quote was, most aspects of the modern world. I'm like, thinking, what planet are you from, lady? I mean, that might sound rude, but seriously, what is she talking about? Creationists can't accept most aspects of the modern world. And the only example she gave was, specifically, they reject evolution. And I'm like, look it. You have plenty of PhD scientists out there rejecting evolution. Basically, this whole video was saying, oh, well, there's not a debate in the scientific community about evolution. I'm like, how can you maintain that? I've heard this argument several times, and it's nonsense. Because you have plenty of scientists who are debating evolution. Ergo, there is a debate within the scientific community about evolution. You have members of the scientific community who are debating it. And come on, and people say, well, they're doing so for religious reasons. Look, a lot of them aren't. Some of them have looked into the evidence, and as a result, have gone from being an atheist to becoming a Christian. Dr. John Sanford, who I've talked to before, he started out his career as an atheist. At some point, he became a Christian. And when he looked into the scientific arguments for creation, he was a theistic evolutionist, so he was able to accommodate evolution within his religious views. But he looked at the arguments for creation, and he found them to be compelling enough where he's like, you know what, this is better science. And you know what, this is a guy who's the inventor of the gene gun. This is one of the most important scientists in the field of plant biotechnology. He's now semi-retired, ish. But, I mean, it's like, come on, you have plenty of top scientists who are arguing for creation. You have Dr. Raymond Damadian, the inventor of the MRI. And there's actually quite a bit of talk that he was rejected the Nobel Prize purely because he's a creationist. I remember reading about a heart surgeon out in Australia who's studying who's studying different parts of the circulatory system for from kangaroos for transplant into humans. I think it was the aortic valve, but I could be mistaken on that. So instead of using pig aortic valves, he was wanting to use kangaroos, and apparently they actually work a lot better, which is interesting in evolutionary perspective because kangaroos are supposed to be more distantly related to humans than pigs. Yet the aortic valve from kangaroos works better. And of course that doesn't totally contradict evolution or anything. It's just probably wouldn't have been expected right on the face of it, but evolution could well accommodate that, even reasonably. But they're talking about there being a controversy in the public eye, and oh, here's one quote from them. They said, "There's no controversy within the biologists and within people who work within evolutionary theory." That's completely false. There's plenty of biologists out there who deny evolution, who don't think that Darwinian evolution holds up. Michael Behe, for example, very famous intelligent design proponent, he's a Catholic. And of course, as you know, the Pope has declared that evolution's more than a theory. The Catholic Church, for several popes now, has accepted evolution. And he grew up, he learned about evolution, he said, okay, you know what, if that's how God did it, then, you know, who am I to say otherwise? And, you know, he ended up looking into the arguments against evolution. He ended up looking into things like the mathematical arguments, the major problems with evolution scientifically, and he said, you know what, he didn't think, afterwards, he's like, you know what, neo-Darwinism really doesn't work. And I would look at him as really the Darwin of the intelligent design movement. And I'd look at his book called, the first book he had on the subject was Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. You have a PhD biochemist debating evolution. I mean, come on. And these guys aren't the only ones. It's not like we have a handful over here. It's not like, oh, we have a debate within the scientific community, but it's just a few guys over there. There's thousands of scientists saying that Darwinian evolution is wrong. And, you know, not just, you have intelligent design advocates, you have creationists, and just in those groups alone, there's thousands, probably tens of thousands. Nobody knows the exact numbers, because scientists who are arguing for creation don't generally wave a flag around saying, oh, I'm a creationist, please fire me from my job. Anybody who goes and watches the movie Expelled, for example, will see that there's been quite a number of scientists who have been fired from their jobs for not accepting evolution, for not accepting neo-Darwinism. And for advocating things like intelligent design. One of the scientists that was interviewed in that movie, actually it was the first one, has 2 PhDs in evolutionary biology. And by the way, he's not even an intelligent design advocate. He just says that he thought that, hey, a lot of what these intelligent design people are saying has a lot of basis to it. They're making some good points. He allowed peer review and publication of an article in a journal associated with the Smithsonian, and as a result of this, he ended up losing his job. Now, I've read what he's had to say since then, and he said that, you know what, ethically, I was taught that you cannot, if you're a journal editor, ethically you are not supposed to reject publication of an article just because you disagree with their viewpoint. If their facts are accurate and everything, if their science is good, you accept it. You don't say, well, I disagree with your views, I disagree with your conclusion, therefore I'm not going to publish your article. That's considered to be unethical. Now, one part of the video they said that people in the intelligent design community and creationists aren't interested in evidence. That's not true, because they've published books and books and books and they've given all kinds of materials presenting the evidence for their case. And Michael Behe has talked about how you could falsify intelligent design reasonably, and he gave reasonable criteria of how you could, in the laboratory, falsify the claims of intelligent design. And I've talked about that more in other videos, and maybe I'll make a video in the future just talking about evolution, intelligent design, and falsifiability. I'm sorry. Sometimes my mind goes a little faster than my mouth in these videos. In science, something has to be falsifiable. That means you potentially have to be able to go into a laboratory and disprove an idea. Now that's oversimplified because there are cases where it's more of an appeal to the best explanation, and Darwin, said at times that his idea was the appeal to the best explanation. In this video, they said that they're not interested in peer review, but there's quite a number of articles arguing for intelligent design in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. The Dover trial, one of the things that the judge this was a dishonest judge. Anybody who doesn't know, the Dover trial was a case in Pennsylvania where they were trying to include intelligent design in the classroom. It was more complicated than that. They were trying to see the Dover trial. Actually, they weren't trying to put it in the classroom. They were trying to wanting to read a small 1-minute statement about evolution is still something that people debate. It's a scientific theory, it's not a fact, and I wouldn't even put it as a theory. And because a theory holds a lot of weight in science, and I don't think evolution holds up to the weight that a theory should have. They wanted to include some supplementary materials for the students. It was interesting because the statement by the judge, his conclusion that he reached, had been handed to him by the ACLU. His conclusion was 90% identical to what the ACLU had written. And his conclusion even included the same typographical errors that the ACLU had in their manuscript. So basically all he did was copy-paste from them and change a couple things. It's 90% identical. I mean, come on. And he said that intelligent design has not generated any peer review articles. Completely not true. Even up to that time, intelligent design advocates had published peer review articles in the scientific literature, and they had several of them, and they have more today. So to say that intelligent design hasn't generated any peer-reviewed literature, anybody who tells you that is either ignorant and mistaken, and of course, I don't mean ignorant in a bad way, they're either mistaken or they're lying, because intelligent design has generated peer-reviewed publications from legitimate scientific institutions. And they've also said that the intelligent design people, rather than appealing to the scientific community and trying to go the normal routes of science, they're like, well, they're trying to appeal to boards of education. I think this is kind of ridiculous because if you go to the Discovery Institute website, their official policy is they're not trying to force teachers in the scientific classroom to teach about intelligent design. And the reason that they're not doing that, one of the big reasons, is teachers in the scientific classroom, for the most part, don't understand intelligent design. They don't know what it says. So whatever they're going to be giving to the students isn't going to be accurate information. They're not trying to force intelligent design into the classrooms. However, they do have a problem with science teachers who want to talk about the subject and want to have an honest conversation with their students being fired for not agreeing with Darwinian evolution. I mean, academic freedom. I mean, come on, if you're a high school student, we're trying to teach them how to think for themselves. We're trying to teach them to use their brains. And it's interesting that they're saying, oh, well, there's anybody who doesn't agree with evolution, it's because they're not scientifically educated or because they're religious. But you know what? There is such a problem that the evolutionists have with high school biology teachers saying, you know what, I don't agree with evolution. And they want to say, you know what, intelligent design they make some valid points. If this were 1 or 2 cases, maybe it wouldn't be an issue, but it's widespread, so that's why they're having to attack science teachers and censor them. This is why they're having to attack scientists and censor them. This is why you have a scientist who's working hard in a laboratory, trying to come up with new treatments for cancer. I actually know a scientist who's working with treatments for cancer by trying to inhibit the growth of blood vessels because a tumor needs blood to grow. And he he's pro-intelligent design. Imagine somebody like this who's doing good research in the laboratory being fired simply for not agreeing with the evolutionist religious beliefs. Because that's what they are, they're religious beliefs. When you're not allowed to disagree with somebody, that's dogma. And you know what? All this is the same thing that the Catholic Church did for like 1,000 years. Anybody who doesn't agree with us is a heretic. That's basically what their position was. And evolutionists are doing the same thing. They're like, any scientist who doesn't agree with us is not a real scientist. And you know what? They can't use the word heretic because people would see right through that. But this is exactly what it is people are coming out with ideas that are heresy purely because they don't go along with the mainstream. And basically because the mainstream can't defend itself. And you know what? They sit there and say that they try to say, oh, well, these intelligent design people don't come out with evidence and science to back up what they have to say, but then they say their arguments have been refuted. I mean, come on, this is a total contradiction. They accuse the intelligent design people of wanting people to be afraid to teach evolution. That's not true. A lot of what they've said is they want people to learn more about evolution. They don't want people to be ignorant about evolution. I'm a creationist. I don't want people to be ignorant about evolution. Do you have any idea how many people get on my YouTube channel and they're ignorant about what evolution actually has to say? Do you have any idea how many lay people get on my channel and they don't even understand evolution? They haven't taken the time to really learn it. They haven't taken the time to educate themselves about evolution, let alone what people like creation scientists have to say, or intelligent design advocates, because like I said, there's plenty of scientists who don't agree with evolution. To say that there's not a debate is completely ridiculous, because it's factually untrue to say that there's no debate in the scientific community, because there's plenty of members of the scientific community who are debating it, and there's other people who are arguing back. And you know what? A lot of evolutionists have said, well, we don't want to publicly debate these creationists because we don't want to give any validity to what they have to say. No, the reason you don't want to publicly debate them is because you lose basically every time. Evolutionists aren't able to hold up, their viewpoints don't work. They aren't able to back up what they have to say. And by the way, speaking of debates, there's actually going to be a debate between Ken Ham, who's not a scientist, but he's a creation speaker. There's going to be a debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye the Science Guy. So anybody who's interested, I think they're selling the tickets right now, and I'm sure they'll sell the video. I'm going to wait till they sell the video, and then I'll watch it. Another thing they said in the video is they accused God of being a bad engineer. They're like, oh, the God that the creationists have, well, he made the human eye and the human jaw, and they said that the way the human eye is wired, with the way that it's wired, they said, well, no intelligent God would ever wire the human eye like that. Now, this argument's been totally refuted. You know, the way that the evolutionists want to wire their eye, if you ended up looking at a bright spot too long, for more than a second or two, you'd be blind for months. The way the human eye is wired is optimal. When you're doing engineering, not everything can... This argument's been totally refuted. I can't go into details with it right now because I'm already at 19 minutes. They also said the human jaw has been stupidly designed because they're like, oh, the human jaw can't accommodate all your teeth. Oh, that's so stupid. I'm like, look at the Australian Aborigines. They didn't have any problem with their wisdom teeth until they introduced a modern diet. Our modern diet, where we have all these really refined foods, we're not chewing a lot, our jaws aren't able to develop properly. This is what we're sitting here eating freaking TV dinners instead of eating real meat, instead of eating actual vegetables, instead of actually chewing things. This idea that the human jaw isn't able to accommodate all our teeth is ridiculous, because usually it can. I mean, Anyway, I always find this ridiculous. That theistic evolutionists will come up with this. They'll come up with all these alleged examples of bad engineering in nature. And then they'll say, well, this proves that the God of the creationists is incompetent. Because they'll point out death, disease, suffering, and things that aren't optimal engineering. And they'll say, well, then they'll attack God by saying, well, why would God do this? Why would God make this, this, and this? But I'm like, look at your worldview. You think that God used evolution to create all this. So, I mean, even in your worldview, you would say that God, in an evolutionary worldview, you can't get around the idea that God created a world full of death, disease, and suffering. If you look at the creationist view, intelligent design would be very neutral on this because they're just because the way it is. But if you look at the creationist worldview, originally things were created to be very good. There wasn't all this death, disease, and suffering. I find it really, I can't understand this. Why evolutionists make this fallacy? Theistic evolutionists will say, well, they're like, well, why would God be so stupid to do this? And they kind of come up with this almost, I'm smarter than God type arguments. They're like, well, no God in the world would wire the eye like, no, well, why would God wire the eye like this? Why would God create a world full of disease? And I'm like, well, if you believe in theistic evolution, you think that God did create a world full of disease. If you believe in creation, you think that disease is the result of the fall. Their arguments are totally irrational and totally illogical. And of course, at the end, they said, they kind of closed out with this idea of, oh, well, these creationists are trying to create a theocracy. So they made this all about politics. It's interesting how quickly evolutionists go to politics and religion. They're not willing to debate our actual scientific arguments. I've only twice seen an evolutionist acknowledge that creationists... There's only 2 evolutionist sources I've ever seen that say, oh, well, yes, creationists teach that species change over time. Most evolutionists out there will say, oh, well, creationists deny that species change over time, which is a complete straw man argument. Even in the time of Darwin, anybody who reads Origin of Species will see that even in Darwin's time, everybody acknowledged that species changed. That wasn't a matter of debate. They had a different definition of what a species was, but nobody denied that species change. He even cited the book of Genesis, pointing out a shepherd who was able to selectively breed his sheep in order to get desired results. It's ironic that Darwin actually cited Genesis on this. Very ironic. But it's interesting, another example from Book of Genesis is plants ended up developing thorns. So this idea that creationists deny that species change, it doesn't work with anybody who's... I mean, come on. No, they haven't. Creationists... I have never seen a scientist arguing for creation deny that species change. This is a straw man argument. And the reason that evolutionists put it out there is because they can't debate our actual arguments and survive. They're unable to address our actual arguments. So this is a real problem. And this whole business with, oh, well, we're going to have a theocracy like in Iran. It's interesting how they like to lump Muslims and Christians together. The Quran does not respect human dignity. The Bible does. People have all this business, oh, the Bible teaches slavery. And you know what? A lot of times that's a legitimate question. It says in the Bible there are times where slavery was accepted. But the word slavery meant something totally different. It didn't mean American slavery. The only thing you need to see that American slavery was repugnant in the eyes of God is to look at Moses. And also you need to take into account the fact that almost all of the abolitionist groups were pushing for their ideas based on the idea that God created men equal. Evolutionists can't say that all men are created equal, because they don't believe that men are created. They might have some fluffy spiritual view of, well, our souls are made equal. Look, you believe that God created a world full of death, disease, and suffering. That's what you believe. Don't try to pin that on creationists. You think that all of this alleged stupid design is the result of your God. You think that all of this this world that God allegedly created full of death, disease, and suffering, that's your God. That's not the God of the Bible. And the God of theistic evolution is not the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible hates death, disease, and suffering. He says that death is his enemy. Jesus wept when Lazarus died. I mean, come on. I always find it ridiculous that evolutionists have to come up with these nonsense arguments, because basically they can't win an actual debate. They'll say, oh, well, there's no scientist debate arguing for intelligent design. Yes, there are. There most certainly are. And they're lying when they say this sort of thing, saying, oh, well, there's no controversy within the biologists. Look, there's plenty of biologists debating it, and within people who work within evolutionary theory. Look, I would not expect an evolutionary biologist generally to come out and say, oh, well, I don't think that evolution really happened. I mean, come on. They're going to want to keep their jobs. And if they end up kind of starting to lean in the direction of intelligent design and starting to become, if that's starting to put ideas in their head, they're not going to tell you because they want to keep their jobs. But in this, like I pointed out, there was a case, there's at least one case of an evolutionary biologist saying, you know what, intelligent design makes some really good points. As a result, he lost his job, and they started calling him, oh, well, you're a Christian, and you're a Republican. It came all down to politics and religion. Go watch the Expelled movie. Go watch the Expelled video and tell me that there's no scientists arguing for evolution. And you know what? I think it's really pejorative that evolutionists will say, oh, well, this biochemist out here doesn't agree with me, therefore he's not a real scientist. I'm like, grow up. Grow up. And you know what? How about addressing our actual arguments instead of lying about us to the public? That's what I've got to say. Anyway, subscribe, comment, rate. Check out my websites, greenslug.com. Slug is spelled with 2 G's. That's my blog. And also check out blueslug.com, which is my science search engine. And again, slug is spelled with 2 G's. And by the way, on greenslug.com I have a creation search engine where you can search websites of PhD scientists who are young Earth creationists. That particular search engine doesn't search intelligent design, doesn't search just a bunch of random blogs. It searches only websites from PhD scientists who argue for young Earth creation. The only exception to that rule is it also searches my blogs because, well, I made the search engine. I want to support my blogs, of course. And also, I'm going for my second degree in biotech, and I've studied creation and evolution like crazy, so I know what I'm talking about. Anyway, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. This is Greg, out.